Okay, hello, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar from the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm Dave Chancellor, and I'll be your host today. Our webinar is going to look at the well-being of families after experiencing homelessness, and is based on a series of briefs produced over the last 4 years that drew on a national study of over 2,200 homeless families. So today we're going to be hearing from Amanda Benton of the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the Department of Health and Human Services, and Carli Wulff of the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation at ACF. So we so appreciate the two of you taking the time to do this. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having us.
I also want to thank the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation for their support of this webinar series, so I would appreciate that. In just a moment here, I'll be turning it over to Amanda and Carli for their presentation, which should take around 40 minutes or so, and after that, they'll take your questions, so make sure to type those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout the webinar today, and we'll get to as many as we can before our time is up. So with that, Amanda and Carli, thanks again for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Sounds great. Thanks, Dave. So this is Amanda Benton, and as Dave mentioned, I'm with the HHS Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation, or ASPE. So I'm really glad to be here. Thank you all for joining us. Before we get started, I just want to give a quick caveat that any views expressed or errors made by Carli and me are entirely our own and do not reflect the views of the Department of Health and Human Services. So our goal today is to try and summarize findings, as Dave mentioned, from a series of briefs that HHS developed using a data set on about 2,000 families in emergency shelter to try and understand their experiences with income, family stability, well-being, and future homelessness. So I'll kick things off with an overview of the data source, which was an impact study run by Apt Associates under contract with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. And then I'll turn it over to Carli to start talking about the findings from the additional analysis we at HHS funded. So before we get into the meat of today's content, I want to provide a bit of background on the impact study from which we're drawing our data, known as HUD's Family Options Study. The study followed almost 2,300 families with children who'd been in shelter for at least a week. And Apt collected lots and lots of data while families were in shelter at baseline, as well as both 20 and 37 months later. So the study was designed so that families were randomly assigned to one of 4 housing interventions: a permanent housing subsidy, like a Section 8 voucher, community-based rapid rehousing, sort of short-term rental assistance and light case management, project-based transitional housing, or usual care, which is basically whatever services families could access on their own in the normal course of things. The study tracked 73 outcomes across 5 domains, and the reason HHS is so excited about the study is that in addition to tracking housing stability, the study also looked at family preservation, adult and child well-being, and self-sufficiency. There were loads and loads of data sources, primarily from study families. So I mentioned the baseline survey and 20 and 37 month follow-up surveys. But in addition, Apt collected child assessments of children who were ages 3.5 to about 8 in conjunction with those adult follow-up surveys. And then they actually did surveys of older children, ages 8 to 17. So with all of that, we've got a lot of data from the families directly. And then the study also includes data from homeless service providers and administrative data. So there's really rich information. The study was conducted in 12 sites across the country. You can see here those sites. There's kind of a good range of geographic areas, diverse housing markets, economies, et cetera. So just to give you a quick snapshot of these families when they're in shelter, kind of at baseline, it was mostly female-headed families, but almost a third of the families had 2 adults in shelter. Median age of the adults was about 29. Parents had typically been homeless for about 6 months in their lifetime and were earning about $12,000 on an annualized basis. Almost half had experienced domestic violence, and a not insignificant number had a recent history of drug use. So the cool thing, or at least I think it's a cool thing, about this study design is that it let HUD make 6 pairwise comparisons of families who were eligible for each of the 2 interventions in that comparison. So in other words, we could compare each intervention to each other intervention. I know this slide is a little bit confusing, but basically each plus sign represents a statistically significant impact on one of the 18 pre-selected primary outcomes of interest. So the major storyline here is that permanent subsidies had a big impact, not just on housing stability, but also on the outcomes in the other domains. Conversely, project-based transitional housing, community-based rapid rehousing, and usual care were, with a few exceptions, fairly similar to each other in terms of outcomes, though I will say community-based rapid rehousing was the least expensive of the interventions. So 37 months after staying in a shelter, being randomly assigned to get a permanent housing subsidy, like a Section 8, halved the number of families who spent at least one night in shelter, places not meant for human habitation, or doubled up in the past 6 months from 38% to 17%. Also, in the year before that, it reduced the proportion of families with a stay in shelter by more than 3/4, 19% to 15%. But beyond literal homelessness, it also affected housing stability more broadly. Those subsidies increased the number of families living in their own place and reduced recent residential mobility. But one reason for HHS's interest in this study is that, as I mentioned earlier, in addition to affecting housing stability, assignment to a permanent housing subsidy, like a Section 8 compared to usual care, affected primary outcomes in all the other domains. So both 20 and 37 months after a shelter stay, we saw reduced psychological distress and intimate partner violence among parents. We saw fewer families who were food insecure. On the negative side, it did reduce the portion of family heads who had worked at all between 20 and 37 months, from 64% in the sort of usual care control group to 58% if they got the subsidy. But there's more too, right? 20 months after the initial shelter stay, being assigned to that permanent subsidy group reduced the proportion of families who were separated from a child who'd been with them in shelter at baseline, and reduced the number of parents exhibiting signs of alcohol dependence or drug use. Permanent subsidies also had an impact on school mobility at both 20 and 37 months after that initial shelter stay, school absences 20 months later, and it reduced parent reports of child behavior problems 37 months after that initial shelter stay. Something a little bit more ambiguous, 37 months later, being assigned to get that permanent housing subsidy versus the usual care group, increased separations from spouses or partners who've been with the family at baseline in shelter. Given the high intimate partner violence rates among this group, it's not really clear to what extent we should think about that as a good thing versus a bad thing, but I think it's an interesting finding nonetheless. I won't get into the details, but as you saw from the summary chart a couple slides ago, we did see some similar benefits of permanent subsidies compared to both community-based rapid rehousing and project-based transitional housing around housing stability and a few other areas. Okay, I just tried to condense, I think, like 500 pages worth of reports into maybe 6 or 7 minutes. I didn't get into the findings on the other interventions or the cost data or lots and lots of other interesting findings. So I do strongly encourage you to check out the full study. The link to HUD's study page is included at the end of the slide deck. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Carly to really dive in.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. As Amanda said, there's a ton of data available, and so we're just so grateful that we were able to use the data to ask some other questions. With such rich, detailed data available, collected over these multiple points in time, as Amanda mentioned, HUD realized that they couldn't possibly analyze all of the data that they had for their main impact study, because if 500 pages isn't enough, it would be hundreds and hundreds of more pages. Of course, HUD is not the only federal agency that's interested in family homelessness, and many of the data items, as Amanda mentioned, that were collected were of interest to HHS, including family and child well-being, self-sufficiency, and more. So our offices within HHS wanted to dive into additional analysis to understand these topics. Arguably, the Family Option Study is the single richest study of data of families experiencing homelessness to date. So OPRE, my office, and ASBE, Amanda's office, contracted with APT, the same contractor that did HUD's study, to conduct these additional analyses. Ultimately, OPRE and ASPE jointly released 4 briefs with an additional 6 briefs released by OPRE. We, of course, want to thank HUD for making the data available to us and to you, which Amanda will talk about at the end of today's presentation. We also want to thank APT for their work on conducting these analyses and producing what we think is an excellent series of briefs. So I'm going to talk for a bit about a few of the briefs, and then Amanda will follow me to talk about some of the additional briefs on parental behavioral health, predictor and returns to homelessness, and about child and adolescent well-being. With so many topics to cover, we're not going to cover everything that was produced in the brief, but please do know that there are links at the end of the presentation for all of the full briefs, and we'll have links to the HUD site too, as Amanda mentioned. One quick note before we discuss the finding from the briefs, we are not going to mention this as we go through each of the topics, but rather than using the experimental nature of the design that Amanda just talked about, our briefs use descriptive and exploratory analyses to understand the topics of interest to HHS. Each brief, if you are able to go in and read the briefs and have interest in doing that, will tell you more about which subpopulations we used for each analysis and any information about comparison groups, which Amanda and I just don't have time to cover today. All right, so we're going to talk about the first of the briefs. Of the many questions HHS wanted to address, a primary question was about employment and earnings for families experiencing homelessness. OPRE released this brief in August of 2018 using data collected at baseline, as well as 20 and 37 months later. To better help HHS understand the employment of parents and families experiencing homelessness, we compared the employment of families in shelter with families in their same communities who were below 50% of the poverty level. Just 17% of families in emergency shelter had a working parent, seen on the left, compared to 27% of other families below 50% of the poverty level. Among that 17% of parents who were employed in the week before shelter entry, most had low earnings. Employed parents worked an average of 27 hours per week at their main job, with an average hourly wage of just $9.40. Even if the parent was employed at this job continuously over a year, family annual earnings would total only $13,200 a year. We also wanted to know why parents weren't working, and so APT asked this question to all participants. When asked why they had not worked, the primary reason for not working during the past week, 1/3 of parents reported that they were interested but unable to find work, seen here in the second to bottom bar of this chart. 1 in 6 parents reported childcare or other family responsibilities, and still other parents reported health issues, housing, and school as the primary reasons for not working. This is a little bit of a complicated exhibit, but I'll explain it to you. 37 months after being in shelter, employment rates increased from 17% to 38%. However, this increase masked instability for families during the follow-up period. In this exhibit, the percent of families without a working parent are shown in red, and the percent of working parents are shown in blue. The top row of the exhibit shows employment during shelter. The middle row shows employment 20 months later, and the bottom row shows employment 37 months later. It shows that parents moved in and out of employment over the course of the 37-month follow-up period. Nearly half of parents did not work at any of the 3 points in time the study collected data, as indicated by the red bar in the bottom row, circled here. And only 7% of parents were working at baseline, as well as at 20 and 37 months later, as shown in the blue bar circled here. Still other parents, as indicated throughout this graphic, cycled in and out of employment at the 3 points in time the study collected data. Overall, these patterns demonstrate weak ties to the labor market and considerable moving in and out of employment over 3 years. Finally, for the employment analysis, we examine the relationship between employment and housing instability. Families with lower rates of employment appear to be more likely to return to homelessness and housing instability. 3 years after the stay in shelter, 28% of families with a parent who had worked during the past week had been homeless or doubled up. In contrast, 37% of families without a working parent had experienced housing instability in the prior 6 months, depicted in the bars shown here. It is important to note that the direction of this relationship is unclear. That is, we do not know from this analysis if the lack of employment and earnings leads to housing instability, for example, because a family cannot pay their rent, or if housing instability might make it harder to find or maintain employment. In sum, this analysis on employment shows that while in emergency shelter, parents had weak connections to employment, that employment increased 37 months later but remained unstable, and that employment and housing instability are related. Next, we'll turn to a series of briefs, well, just two, that were produced about the receipt of public benefits. OPRE was interested in understanding this because this is important to the Administration for Children and Families. And so we were interested about public benefits, including the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Program, or TANF, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, sometimes called food stamps, and publicly funded health insurance, including Medicaid, the State Children's Health Insurance Program, called CHIP, or other state programs. ASPE and OPRE jointly released the first brief in the series about public benefits in 2016, and a second brief was released by OPRE in 2017. An important reason we wanted to look into this is that there's a hypothesis that families who become homeless are less well connected than other low-income families to the benefits and services of the social safety net for which they are eligible. However, this does not appear to be the case for the sample. In fact, families staying in emergency shelter reported rates of participation in key social safety net programs that were similar or greater than that of other families below 50% of the poverty level in their same communities. As you can see here, 88% of families in shelter received SNAP compared to 69% of families below 50% of poverty in the same community. 86% of families in shelter received publicly funded health insurance compared to 82% of comparable families. And 41% received TANF compared to 22% of families in the same community. 20 months after a stay in shelter, families remained connected to SNAP and health insurance, the top lines of this exhibit, so their rate of TANF fell over time, shown here in the bottom line of the exhibit, falling from 41% in shelter to 33% 20 months later. As with employment, we examined the relationship between benefit receipt and housing instability 20 months after a stay in emergency shelter. This exhibit shows the percent of families receiving each benefit. The navy bars, on the left for each benefit, show the percent of families who had experienced housing instability, and the lighter blue bars, or brighter blue bars, depending on your screen, show those who did not experience recent housing instability. For all three benefit types, fewer families received benefits after experiencing housing instability. The pattern also holds in reverse. Families receiving benefits were less likely to report continued housing instability. So as you can see, we again do not know the direction of this relationship. In sum, as we think about the receipt of benefits, families in shelter are connected to public benefit programs at similar rates to families below 50% of the poverty level in their same communities 20 months later. Families remain connected to SNAP and health insurance, though their connection to TANF falls somewhat. And similarly to employment, there was a relationship between housing and receipt of benefits, but our exploratory analysis cannot show the direction of that relationship. As we discuss family separations, I'll be drawing again on two briefs produced under this series. Families experiencing homelessness often experience separations from their children and from other adults in the family. This project produced two briefs, one looking at both child and adult separations 20 months after the stay in emergency shelter, released jointly by OPRE and ASBE in 2017, and another looking at child separations 37 months later, released by OPRE in 2018. During their stay in emergency shelter, about 30% of families were separated from at least one family member. I'll first discuss families who reported they had an adult partner, of whom 27% stated that that partner was not present with them in shelter. After our discussion of adult partner separations, I'll discuss our analysis of the 24% of families who reported one or more children separated during the emergency shelter stay. In shelter, about 37% of families reported they had an adult partner. This chart shows data about those families. The top row shows, for families identifying a partner, the percent present in shelter and the percent not with the family in emergency shelter. On the left, in a gray bar, we can see that 73% of adult partners were present with the family in shelter. On the right, in tan, we see that for 27% of families with an adult partner, that partner was not with the family in shelter. Among families with an adult partner, many experienced changes in family composition over time. The middle row of the chart shows changes 20 months after that stay in shelter for those families with a second adult. For more than a fifth of the families, 22% circled here, a partner with the family in shelter was no longer with the family 20 months later. This change in family composition is greater than changes for other poor families below 50% of the poverty level. The 22% of sheltered homeless families with new separations for partners over a 20-month period is slightly higher than the 15% of such separations among families below 50% of the poverty level. However, as you'll see in the future slides for child separations, changes are not unidirectional. While some families experience additional separations, other families experience reunifications. About 1 in 10 families saw the adult partner returning to the family 20 months later. In addition to looking at adult separations, the two briefs looked closely at child separations, starting by looking at the characteristics of the 17% of children who were separated from their families when the family was in emergency shelter. Amanda mentioned a little bit about this, but on average, a separated child was 10 years old. The median length of separation was 18 months, representing a relatively long separation. The majority had been separated for over a year. Boys were only slightly more likely to be separated than girls, 17% versus 16%. As you can see in this graphic, most separated children were living with other family members, including the other parent, 44%, grandparents, 25%, or other relatives, 22%. Of note, very few of the children, just 3%, were in formal foster care. As I discussed with adult separations, there are changes in child separation over time. The exhibit here shows a relative stability in the percent of families having at least one child separated at shelter in 20 months later, 24% versus 23%. Additionally, 1 in 4 families, not depicted in this chart, also had a child separated 37 months after a shelter stay. This chart, however, masks changes in family composition over time. Although nearly 3/4 of families had all children present at each point in time, some children were reunited while additional children were separated at the point in time data was collected. Graphics representing this churning are available in the brief, and while I'd love to show you them, it would take entirely too much of our short time together. The takeaway for me is that the relative stability shown in this chart masks change for many families, including reunifications and additional separations. Finally, as we did for both employment and benefits, we looked at the relationship between child separations and housing instability. At both 20 and 37 months after experiencing a stay in emergency shelter, the analyses and the briefs show associations between child separations and housing instability. 37 months after the initial shelter stay, more than 1/3, 37%, of families of children who were separated reported spending at least one night homeless in the previous 6 months, shown on the right, compared to 13% of families of children who were not separated from the family, shown on the left. Again, our exploratory analysis does not show direction of this relationship. In sum, families experience separations of both adult partners and children in shelter and during the 37-month follow-up period. Adult and child separations evolve over time, with additional separations and reunifications happening for families, although the overall pattern shows stability. For separated children, they tend to stay with other family members. And once again, child separations and housing instability are related. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Amanda to share information about the remaining brief.
Thanks, Carly. So in addition to looking at adults and families, we also zeroed in specifically on children. So I'm going to start with some findings on young children from a brief published jointly by AFSCME and OPRE in 2017. One of the things that often surprises folks, or at least surprised me when I first learned it, is that the age at which a person in the U.S. is most likely to stay in emergency shelter is infancy. So we at HHS were particularly interested in understanding the experiences of young children after a shelter stay. And by young children, I mean less than 5 years old. So we found, not surprisingly, that experiencing homelessness had impact on these children. Preschool children were at higher risk of early developmental delays, especially fine motor skill delays, and behavioral problems, especially hyperactivity, conduct problems, and peer problems, compared to national norms. These children also showed moderate disadvantages in reading readiness and slight disadvantages in math readiness. One important caveat to the information I just gave is that we didn't have comparable data on young children in poverty. So unlike some of the benchmarks that Carly talked about, those comparisons I just made are to all children in the country, regardless of income level. That said, even within the group of children in shelter, we found differences between those who faced more or less continued instability. So 20 months after staying in the shelter, a lot of families with young children faced continued housing instability, but also instability with their child care arrangements. And that makes sense. Often child care arrangements are based on location, right? So if a family is frequently moving, it may be hard for them to maintain those arrangements. We found that continued more recent homelessness after that initial shelter stay was related to instability in child care arrangements, and that instability was related to somewhat greater behavioral problems among children. Relatedly, we also found that residential mobility was associated with greater behavioral challenges. Each additional move in the past 6 months was associated with higher rates of hyperactivity and peer problems, and with lower reading readiness scores. So all that to say, the 20 months after a shelter stay, young children have worse developmental and behavioral outcomes than their peers nationally, and those who continue to face housing and childcare instability over the next 20 months were more likely to exhibit problem behaviors than those who became stably housed. So as with the other housing instability relationships Carly mentioned, we can't quite tell the direction of causality there. We also looked at child care arrangements more closely, and we found that homeless families are enrolling in Head Start and other center-based child care at rates that are pretty similar to other poor children. But once again, we see a difference between families who continue to experience housing instability and those who became stably housed. So 20 months after a shelter stay, families who experienced housing instability in the last 6 months were more likely to be enrolled in early education and center-based care than those who'd become stably housed. Interestingly, that did not hold true for Head Start, just other early education and center-based care. Similar to what we see in the broader literature on early childhood, children who were enrolled in Head Start or other early childhood education and center-based care had stronger math and reading readiness compared to all other preschoolers who were only in parental care. So ongoing housing instability is related to enrollment in early education and center-based care, and access to those resources is related to academic readiness. That's young children, but what about older children? ASPE and OPURI also published a brief jointly back in 2016, looking at the experiences of adolescents who are homeless as part of a family. And we found that most adolescents continue to live with their families 20 months after they were in shelter together. They didn't strike out on their own for the most part. But 20 months after a shelter stay, 35% of families in the study had moved at least once in the past 6 months. That's almost double the average annual mobility rate for families below the federal poverty level, which is about 14.5% of a rate. So that's a pretty big difference. You're even talking about different time frames. In addition to residential mobility, we saw increased school absences. So adolescents who'd been in shelter 20 months ago were much more likely to have been absent from schools than their peers nationally at all income levels. 30% had missed school 3 or more times in the past month. Despite federal safeguards designed to prevent this, many students do change schools because of moving across school catchment boundaries or because of the geographic location of temporary accommodations. And on average, adolescents who'd been in shelter with their families attended 2 schools in the 20 months after that shelter stay, with 70% changing schools at least once and 23% changing schools at least twice. And those figures compare to 21% of 8th graders and 10% of 12th graders nationally across all income levels who changed schools at least once. So you really do see increased school mobility here. As with other areas, we see something different for those adolescents who continue to experience housing instability after that initial shelter stay than for adolescents who had been in shelter but became stably housed. The group with ongoing housing instability was more likely to have been absent from school or to have changed schools. And we also saw that adolescents who continue to experience housing instability displayed more problem behaviors than those who became stably housed. This is probably not surprising. We know from the broader literature that changing schools can be associated with reduced academic performance. And so it's not surprising that we found that adolescents who'd been in shelter and changed schools frequently had lower grades, they had less motivation towards school, and actually slightly more social problem behaviors than their peer adolescents who'd been in shelter but did not change schools. We also saw a relationship to overcrowding. Previously homeless adolescents who lived with their families in overcrowded housing had higher school absences than those who hadn't. So, in a nutshell, we see high overall school mobility among adolescents who'd been in shelter, and those who continued to experience housing instability had more school moves, which was related to worse academic and behavioral outcomes. As the series started to wrap up, OPRE published a brief in 2018 looking at the behavioral health of parents who'd been in shelter. We found that parents in homeless shelters reported high rates of PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, and psychological distress on the mental health side, and then also of alcohol dependence and drug use on the substance use side. But all of those problems diminished over the next 37 months. The exception was PTSD symptoms, which stayed pretty flat. So, for example, you can see from the slide, 22% of mothers and 13% of fathers were experiencing severe psychological distress after they were in shelter for at least a week. For comparison, about 9% of adults with incomes below the federal poverty level and 3 to 4% of parents overall in the U.S. across all income levels have those rates, or have severe psychological distress. So we saw a reduction of almost a quarter in the number of mothers, for example, experiencing severe psychological distress 37 months after that shelter stay. Similarly, drug abuse rates decreased by over 75% among mothers from, I think it's 12% to 3%, as that chart shows, and there's lots more. Parents with the greatest levels of distress while they were in shelter saw the largest improvements over time. And we also found that parents who'd been in foster care as children or who had experienced intimate partner violence as adults had greater psychological distress at the time of shelter entry than those who didn't have those past experiences. So basically, rates of behavioral health issues were high while in shelter, but generally declined in the 37 months after that shelter stay. As with other areas, though, the picture gets a bit more complicated as you dig deeper. Families who reported becoming stably housed 37 months after that initial shelter stay saw dramatic reductions in psychological distress, but parents who returned to homelessness or doubling up continue to have high levels of psychological distress. I mentioned that overall drug and alcohol dependence rates declined over time, but again, we see that ongoing housing stability matters. So those who continue to experience housing instability after that initial shelter stay were more likely to have reported drug or alcohol problems both during the shelter stay and 37 months later than families who had become stably housed. So as with the other pieces Carli mentioned, we can't conclude anything definitive about the causal relationship here, but it is plausible that housing instability and substance problems might influence each other, and there's a bidirectional relationship with each exacerbating the other. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a bit to the last brief in the series, which OPRE published a couple of months ago. All of the experiences we've discussed so far today had a relationship to continued housing instability. Families who didn't become stably housed after that initial shelter stay fared worse on employment, behavioral health, separation, school mobility, children's behavioral problems, etc. So we really want to dig into this idea of persistent homelessness a bit more. Research indicates that most families using emergency shelter only stay briefly, 1 to maybe 4 to 5 months, and rarely return. But some families remain homeless for long periods of time or experience repeated episodes of homelessness. And at least hypothetically, these families might have different characteristics or service needs, right? So practitioners could benefit from being able to identify those families so they could better target services. So we tried to identify family characteristics and past experiences that might help practitioners predict families who would later have repeated or persistent experiences of homelessness or doubling up to better tailor their interventions. So the punchline of what we found is that very few family characteristics and experiences help predict repeated or persistent homelessness. Our data was cool in that it let us look both backwards and forwards for families in emergency shelter. So we looked at 3 measures of repeated and persistent homelessness. The first 2, you already know that we had information on future homelessness as of both 20 and 37 months after the initial shelter stay, so that was 2 of the measures. But during the baseline survey while families were in shelter, we had asked about their past experiences before that shelter stay. So the 3rd measure was of repeated past homelessness before the shelter stay, which in this case we defined as 3 or more times or for more than a year as an adult of past homelessness. So we looked at the 24 characteristics and experiences that you see here on the slide, and we found that most had a relationship to none or only one of those 3 measures. No characteristic was related to all 3 measures of repeated or persistent homelessness. What does that mean as a practical matter? It means that practitioners' ability to identify families who are going to experience repeated or persistent family homelessness increases only very slightly if you use the 24 characteristics rather than randomly choose among families who've been in shelter for a week. So this slide shows that parents in 35% of families had experienced repeated or persistent homelessness before their shelter stay. Now, if you choose randomly, practitioners would correctly identify 35% of families who would experience repeated or persistent homelessness by chance. But you would also falsely attribute that past homelessness to 35% of families who hadn't had it. Using the 24 characteristics on the previous slide would help a practitioner correctly identify only 1 additional parent out of 10 who'd experienced repeated or persistent homelessness before a shelter stay. So you'd still miss over half of parents with this approach. And we saw similar results, as the slide shows, for predicting future homelessness 20 or 37 months after a shelter stay. Compared to choosing families at random, choosing them based on their characteristics would help a practitioner predict fewer than 1 additional family out of 10 who would experience repeated or persistent homelessness over the next 20 or 37 months. All in all, only a few past experiences of parents may help practitioners identify families with repeated or persistent homelessness. So parents who had experienced homelessness as an adult before the current shelter stay had a higher chance of becoming homeless again later after that shelter stay. And parents who'd experienced either homelessness or a foster care placement as a child were more likely to have experienced repeated or persistent homelessness as an adult before the current shelter stay. Though it's important to note for practitioners that relationship does not hold up when you look forward at future shelter stays 20 and 37 months later. So there's some limitations to that. We also found, perhaps surprisingly, that the presence of behavioral health problems are rarely related to persistent or repeated homelessness. In terms of protection strategies for families, we did find that families with disabilities who have disability income, either SSI or SSDI, may be less likely to have another episode of homelessness 20 months after a shelter stay, but that relationship kind of fizzles and disappears by 37 months after the initial shelter stay. And then we know from the main impact study, which I discussed at the start of the webinar, that long-term rental assistance, such as like a Section 8 voucher, does protect against returns to homelessness. Lastly, I just want to say that we found that the characteristics associated with doubling up as of 20 or 37 months after a shelter stay are generally not the same as those associated with repeated literal homelessness. So as with literal homelessness, few characteristics are predictive of doubling up in the future, but parents' self-reported alcohol dependence or drug use was related to doubling up both 20 and 37 months after a shelter stay. Okay, so that goes through all of the study findings from the brief. I know that was an insane amount of information to throw at you, so please start thinking about questions. But before that, I do just want to kind of generally reflect on what this means for practitioners and policymakers. You know, we found that most parents not working for pay had health or disability issues or family responsibilities or trouble finding a job, suggesting that it's important to think about, you know, holistic, tailored employment, childcare, and health supports, among others. Given the high rates of child separations, it might make sense to think about collecting information on a family's housing status during child welfare investigation, intake, and monitoring to help families limit and hopefully even avoid periods of housing instability. We saw that school and childcare instability are related to housing instability, and that those types of school instability can compound challenges that children are facing. There are some existing policy levers through Head Start, the Child Care and Development Fund, and the Education for Homeless Children and Youth programs that could help with that instability, but it's an area we should be attentive to and proactive in. Overall, hopefully the theme came through that we found that continued housing instability was related to worse outcomes in every single one of the domains that we explored today. But we can't tell the direction of causality. In many cases, if not most cases, I think we have a reason to suppose that the relationship is bidirectional. So for example, the lack of employment makes it difficult to afford rent and therefore to maintain stable housing, but housing instability and homelessness make it difficult to maintain a job or focus on finding one. And we could expect similar sort of interconnected challenges with substance use and many of the other areas we talked about today. So it's clear that a lot of systems need to be involved if we want to put homeless families at the center of our work and improve outcomes. I think there's still a lot of questions that were not answered and that the field still needs to figure out, but we hope and think that this analysis has helped provide a better picture of homeless families' experiences and well-being. That said, there is still a ton of untapped data in the Family Option Study dataset, and it's available to you. So the data are available for secondary data analysis through census. I know HUD is hoping additional questions are examined. So if that's something that would be of interest to you, please look into that because it's a really tremendous opportunity for some additional analysis. Okay, I think we're going to stop up there and turn it back over to Dave for some questions.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda and Carli. I thought that was, I mean, as you said, you've got a ton of information to us, and I'm really thankful for you doing that. So we've already got some questions rolling in, and from Steph, she asks, what would you recommend for practitioners hoping to target it, sort of limited services? I mean, if they've got kind of a limited budget, what might actually be helpful in terms of, helping out these families that are either going into emergency shelters, so what information could be given there, or in maybe terms of trying to prevent homelessness there. Is there, do you have a sense of that? And Amanda, would you want to take that one?
Sure, and Carli, I hope you'll jump in. I think, I think unfortunately the evidence base here is still somewhat limited, and it's still something we're figuring out. As I mentioned from the main impact study, we know that long-term permanent housing subsidies, like vouchers, like a Section 8 voucher, can really affect both housing stability and a lot of these other domains. So I think that's something really important to think about. The other thing I would just mention is because many of these issues are interconnected, really thinking about those local partnerships, and sometimes families may need multiple wraparound supports to kind of address their needs holistically and put them on the path to economic mobility and self-sufficiency. And so partnering with other providers in the community who might be more expert in other areas and have some additional resources that you could tap into. But Carli, I don't know if you have something more specific.
Amanda, I would just echo what you were saying. I think that so many of these analyses show the interrelatedness between housing instability and other outcomes that are important for family stability. So thinking about relationships with partners and kind of the systematic response is important.
Okay. So our next question from Val kind of, jumps right off that question there. I mean, she's asking about homelessness prevention. And could you tell us more about some of these wraparound services and some of these partnerships? I mean, just a little bit more background information on, do we know anything that's been shown to be effective, or are there things that communities might focus on in particular? And Carli, do you want to take this one first?
I think I will start by answering by saying that I think that this is really important. I'm not sure that we have any handle on this yet. Amanda, do you have more to say?
Not much. I think New York City has done some interesting work trying to target homelessness prevention, and I'm just not that familiar with it, so I don't want to speak too much, but I think they're trying to do some geographic coding based on areas of the community that sort of are seeing high rates of entrance into shelter, and trying to provide rental assistance and other assistance on the front end beforehand. But I think this is an area where there's been a lot of increased attention lately, and so hopefully that will translate into additional resources and research. But I think that we've still got a long way to go, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. So back on slide 33, you talked about sort of being surprised that infants and young children were the age groups that were most likely to be accessing emergency shelters. Could you talk more about that? Because that was a surprise for me too. And did you have more findings related to that could kind of tell us sort of that background story of why that might be, what factors are involved there? And Amanda, do you want to take that one?
Sure. And I will say that I do want to put in a plug for resources from the Office of Head Start and the Office of Child Care for serving some of this population. I know Head Start providers, there's a whole set of interactive lessons on serving homeless children that are out there. The Office of Child Care also has a lot of resources out there. In terms of the drivers, and actually I should say that there's a whole new campaign, Home at Head Start, that has just been launched on sort of trying to serve homeless children through Head Start and get them enrolled in programs. So I do want to just put a plug out for that and say that it's something that HHS is really thinking about and focused on. In terms of the drivers, I don't know that we have a ton of great research. I think anecdotally we do, you can think about families that might be stably housed, living with others in a situation that's really stable and comfortable. You introduce another mouth to feed that's additional cost, that's a lot of stress and noise, and can kind of exacerbate a living situation that might have been stable and kind of put a family over the edge into needing to, for example, enter shelter. And there's just sort of a big period of transition. Carli, I don't know if you have more information on research on kind of causal drivers of that entrance into shelter in infancy.
No, I don't. I do think that there's also a hypothesis not on the kind of entry into homelessness, but that school might serve as a stabilizing factor for families, causing fewer children who are of school age to be homeless.
Okay. Our next question is from Missy, and she asks if there is any information about the reasons for separation of children. Because I know you had, a little bit on that, but, is it safety concerns? What are some of the factors that might be driving those separations that we see?
So I think a key thing to remember here is that only 3% of children who experienced separation were in formal foster care. Most of the families in this study who had a child separation, that child was with another family member, with the other parent, with a grandparent, or some other relative. I think the reasons are probably many and varied. Parents might choose not to have that parent with them, that child with them in shelter. There might be other things going on, though it is important to note that for this study, every parent that was part of the study had at least one child with them, so it wasn't that adults were going to shelter without their children. Amanda, do you have more to say?
No, I think that's about right. I think you could envision a parent making a decision because we saw that most of the children were in informal, as Carli mentioned, not in formal child welfare, but with other relatives, either another parent or grandparent. You can envision parents making or trying to make the best, the best of a situation and try and do what's in the child's best interest and put them with another family member if they're worried about entering shelter. But I think we don't really have a good handle on that, and that's yet another area for further research.
And just quickly to the question, the sample size was so small here, so we didn't look to see if the placements were prompted by connections with Child Protective Services.
Okay. Before you had mentioned these resources from Head Start. Are those easy to find on the Head Start website, or is there any way we could point folks to those?
They are actually...
Yes,
Go ahead, Amanda.
I think if you actually Google Home at Head Start, it should come up.
Yeah, they're surprisingly easy to Google. If you Google Head Start and homelessness, the Early Childhood Learning and Knowledge Center should pop up, and those have the interactive lessons that Amanda was talking about in addition to other resources.
Okay, I just sent out that link here. So, okay, that's helpful. So, okay, and I think going back a little bit, this might be kind of a basic question, but could you give us a picture of what sort of entry into an emergency shelter might look like? I mean, I think one of my questions would be how families that get into a shelter might look different from others, or do most families get in, or who's being turned away, and do you have a sense of what that actually looks like in these sites that you were working through? And Amanda, do you want to take that one first? Sure,
and the short answer is that it very much depends on the community. A few sites, the state of Massachusetts, a couple of cities have a right to emergency shelter for homeless families. So in those cases, and that was the case with one of the study sites, if a family shows up at emergency shelter and there's no room in the shelter, then the homeless providers work together and maybe pay for a hotel or a motel or find something else as a sort of backstop and giving folks a place to stay. But in most of the country, there's just not enough shelter capacity for the number of folks who need it. And so sometimes there are what that process looks like depends on the community in terms of kind of a first come, first serve, or hours, or what the rules look like. But there has been a push by HUD to implement a process called coordinated entry. The idea being that once someone is in shelter or has been sort of gone through that initial stabilization, you could do a quick and dirty, really do an analysis and an assessment of what their needs are and try and match and prioritize folks for other housing resources based on the identified needs and the vulnerabilities that the community lists up. And I think that's a process that is still very much being implemented and fine-tuned at the local level. And in some places that seems to be working really well, and in other places it's still a work in progress, and there's a lot to work through. Okay. Carli, you might have some other thoughts to add, though.
No, I think that was great.
Okay, good. So I want to pull up these links to these reports here and the briefs that you have available, and kind of as we're looking at these, I'll leave these up for the next little bit here. But do you have a sense of how practitioners might want to use these? I mean, do you have kind of a quick take on how we should be looking at these, how practitioners might use them, and things that they can look for in using this data? And Carli, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. I think that there's a lot here, and I think the first question, I believe, that Amanda and I responded to, we slightly touched on this, thinking about the interrelation of so many of these outcomes and the need of systems and programs to work together. I think another thing that I've been thinking a lot about over the course of this project is that some of these topics are not just important for people who are dealing directly with families experiencing homelessness, but who are working with the broader vulnerable population and low-income populations who are receiving benefits or those types of things. In my own work, I do a lot of employment research and thinking about how unstable housing could have impacts on how families are able to seek stable employment. I think that we need to be thinking not just about how homeless families are operating within the context of homelessness programs, but also how folks experiencing housing instability, including homelessness, interact with the other systems that are part of the social safety net.
So I want to give each of you the opportunity to kind of jump on and talk about sort of parting thoughts. What should we be looking towards next? I mean, areas for research or other data collection that could tell us more about these populations, and things that we should know going forward. So, Carli, do you want to start us off here?
As with most research, I think answering a few questions leads to many more questions that we can answer, and I'm excited about having some directions for future research. I think one thing I am interested in would be to see some longer-term analysis of some of these same topics to see how families fare even longer after their experience in emergency shelter.
Okay.
And for me, I think this is Amanda. The fact that housing instability is just related to a bunch of outcomes that human services agencies care about, and these issues are really interconnected, and folks need to work together at the local level. This was really cool in that the study looked both at literal homelessness and also kind of ongoing housing instability, including doubling up, which is not something we see as much data on sometimes. But there's still a lot more that we need to know about how housing instability more broadly and human services programs and outcomes kind of interact. And so I think there's a lot more to be done really at the research policy and practice level to try and figure out what are the best practices, what are the policy levers that are out there, and what are the research questions we need to answer to really improve outcomes for families even more.